Welcome to the Integral Stage and to our first community-generated discussion/debate. Our guests are Matt Segall, a well-known YouTuber, a Whiteheadian scholar, and a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and David Long, also a well-known integral YouTuber, a musician, and recently the launcher of the Integral 2.0 project. And it was his launching of that project, in fact, that led us to this point, to this debate/dialogue. As one of his points in his platform, David criticized the idealist elements in Ken Wilber's framing of integral theory and basically called for a renouncing of idealism and replacing it with a more naturalistic emergentist model. And this triggered Matt, and he responded with a YouTube post, and then that led to a discussion that eventually brought us here. So tonight we're going to give space to each of them to present their views and to test their views with each other, and then see if we can arrive at some integral understanding. So the basic format is going to be that each one of them will have 10 minutes to present their basic view, and I'll ask that any key terms be defined when you're talking about your view. And then they'll each have about 10 minutes to offer questions to each other and probe a little bit deeper. And then at the end, it will open up for a more free-form discussion. So to begin, we'll turn it over to Matt, and he'll get us rolling here.
Thanks, Bruce and David. I'm really glad we could do this. I'm going to try in 10 minutes to provide some context for what led to my initial response to you, David, with Integral 2.0. But before I get into that, I want to just say a bit about this slash between debate and dialogue. I think debate has a place, but I prefer dialogue just because I think there's something dialectical about the very nature of understanding and even rationality itself. Rationality is able to reveal the truth to us in dialogue, and the dialogue would mean it's an intersubjective endeavor, right? So it requires more than just one mind. It's a conversation, but it's a conversation in pursuit of something, in pursuit of a truth that, you know, I hope we can each admit neither one of us possesses yet. And so I do not pretend to have the truth. I am in love with the idea of truth, I'll tell you that much. And I'm doing my best. But I think I really value the opportunity to be in dialogue with others who are also passionate about this, as you are, David, and as you are, Bruce, because it's when we bring our love of the truth and our love of wisdom into dialogue that I think there's real potential to actually evolve consciousness. And so at the same time, sometimes debate can be, I mean, on one hand, it can be fun, it can be entertaining, it can draw people in. I mean, the idea of a debate is way more, I think, alluring for most people than like a conversation or a discussion, especially among academics, because, I mean, who the fuck even knows what they're talking about half the time? And so the idea of like clear positions going up against one another to see like who's got the strength, whose frame is more, you know, penetrating and is going to stab the other one in the heart and kill them, right? So that's way more exciting. But maybe we can do a little bit of that playfully, because there are differences, I imagine, between our views, and we do want to get to the bottom of that. But I think we also have a common goal here, which is to understand what the hell is going on. So just having gotten that out of the way, sort of as a preface to my remarks, I also want to say that with Integral 2.0, I felt with your initial video and my response, what I was really trying to do was not like defend creationism, certainly, or cosmological idealism, but the way in which, David, you were putting forward Integral 2.0 felt to me to be a little bit imbalanced, such that it was almost like calling forth its opposite or conjuring an enemy into existence, which I felt responsible to play that part of the enemy you were conjuring, to say, hey, you know, the idealists, they're not so bad. And I know in my initial video, I was equivocating between all sorts of different kinds of idealism. And you were specifically talking about creationism, let's just call it that. The idea that some transcendent God designed and planned the world and then created the whole thing just because it felt like it, and kind of tortures us with the idea of sin, like all this horrible stuff that fundamentalist Christians and Muslims and other people believe. That notion of creationism, if that's what Integral 2.0 is like going to bat against, I'm with you in that fight. But the issue is that I also think there's a way in which, at least in the popular culture, when these debates get framed, the creationists are always going up against the atheists and the scientific materialists. And I know you're not one of those, but that's how the debate is usually framed. It's creationism versus a very reductionistic rendering of evolutionary biology, like Dawkins type stuff, and a very reductionistic rendering of physics and cosmology. And so in that framework, I'm not really on either side. I think Richard Dawkins is as obsessed with the idea of God as the fundamentalist theists are, actually, and that there's a better type of conversation we can be having that does involve talking about emergence. And so I do want us to be able to get into the details, in particular scientific disciplines, on how they use that word. Physicists use it, chemists use it, biologists use it, psychologists use it, cognitive scientists use it, and they all mean it in some similar sense, like generally, but they're talking about specific processes, and we should get into those details. I mean, I think you've been calling for this, and I haven't really gone there yet in any of my video responses to you. So the debate that I would rather have is not that between creationism and materialism. I'm not saying you're a materialist, but I also don't want to have the debate between idealism, cosmological idealism, if you want, and emergentism. And here's why. So I think the debate we should be having, before I say why, is one between what I would call evolutionary panpsychism, which comes out of my reading of, the German idealist Friedrich Schelling and the British mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, evolutionary panpsychism versus eliminative materialism. And I think eliminative materialism is actually the more rigorous position, given a particular reading of science right now, than is emergentism. So here's my issue with emergentism. And these are really questions for you. You don't have to answer them in your introduction, but we'll get to them later. When we talk about the emergence of consciousness out of matter or out of neurochemistry, we either mean a form of what's called soft emergence or hard emergence. Soft emergence would be something like a qualitative inner experience, like flickers on when brain chemistry gets complicated enough, which I've never really heard a theory or a theoretical mechanism for how that might be possible. It's not like hydrogen and oxygen emerging into water. When you're talking about neurochemistry turning into interior life and consciousness, it's more like there's an ontological transformation taking place. It's not just more complex behavior emerging. It's interiority appearing in a new dimension that didn't exist before. It was just material surfaces colliding, and then all of a sudden this interior domain opens up. That's a very different kind of emergence. But we can interpret that, the emergence of consciousness, as not having any causal effect on a physical body, not having any ability to alter the behavior of the body, so that an organism like us, I guess, that is conscious, is only conscious in the way that, in the sense that, there's an awareness of what's going on, but there's no ability to alter what's going on. So we might have the subjective illusion of free will, but there's nothing really happening that allows us to control our bodies. That's an epiphenomenal view of emergent consciousness. The other possibility is that when consciousness emerges, this would be hard emergence, there's some downward causative influence that this new ontological domain, this consciousness, is able to exert on the physical body. And then when you try to understand consciousness in an evolutionary way, you can start to see how, consciousness could have evolved because it was influencing the behavior of organisms and could be selected for by Darwin's mechanism. If consciousness is just epiphenomenal, there's no mechanism for it to be selected for evolutionarily. It may as well not exist. So maybe you have another understanding of what the emergence of consciousness looks like, but these are the two possibilities that I have considered, and they seem to me to be either epiphenomenalism, where how could that even evolve if it has no influence over the organism's behavior, or a kind of strong emergence or hard emergence where there's a new domain that all of a sudden has freedom and can change the behavior of the body. And to me, that seems like dualism. So emergence either leaves us in a dualistic view where there's this new consciousness that emerges, that never existed in the material universe, but has power over that universe, at least its own body and what the body can do in the world. Or we have the emergence of this epiphenomenal ghost that really does nothing, and so why do we even bother talking about it? And that's why I think eliminative materialism is actually the more rigorous position scientifically, because it doesn't require dualism, it doesn't require epiphenomenalism. It just says, we have a word for like consciousness and mind, but really that's just a confused way of speaking, and we should really just start talking in terms of hormones and neurotransmitters and physiology. This is what like Paul and Patricia Churchland, the eliminative materialists, would argue for. And so I think that's a more rigorous and internally consistent position as regards consciousness and its relationship to the material world than emergentism. And so I would rather square off against that and try to articulate the alternative that I'm calling evolutionary panpsychism as more coherent. Now, I'm probably close to my 10 minutes, and I haven't said much about, I have 3 minutes left. Great. I haven't said much about evolutionary panpsychism yet, so let me try to condense that into 3 minutes. I'll start with the scientific revolution, okay? Copernicus looks at some ancient Greek mathematicians and astronomers, and he's like, oh yeah, they had this idea of the sun at the center. That might make the math a little simpler. And he comes up with this heliocentric model. That sets off this chain reaction, culminates in Newton articulating the laws of universal gravitation and his laws of physics. And this is in 1700 that Newton publishes the Principia. And at that point, there's a sense among intelligent people in Europe that, wow, the whole universe can be understood mechanistically, and we can represent those machinations mathematically. And more, there's a sense in which, oh, we can actually explain even like the human body in this way, and maybe there really is no soul. And it really set off this, that's the Enlightenment, right? And Immanuel Kant, how much do I have, like 1 minute left? Immanuel Kant, looks at Newtonian physics and how masterfully it describes the determinism of nature in precise mathematical, geometrical terms. And he's like, wow, that's true. But then he looks at his experience of conscience, the notion of morality, and the fact that human beings, if our social relationships are law and politics and religion for Kant, if any of that's real, it's because we have freedom. It's because if any of human culture is real, it's because we can be held responsible for our actions. And so we can't just be machines. And so Kant's like, okay, how do I fit this Newtonian picture of a mechanical universe with my interior experience of freedom? And he ends up constructing what's called Transcendental Idealism, where he says, the nature that Newton was describing is actually a mental construct, because the human mind doesn't see reality as it is in itself. The human mind constructs a reality. We have sensory experience of space and time. Even our experience of space is based on touch and sight. It has a sensory basis, Kant says. But he thinks that space and time are transcendental in the sense that they're universal and they're necessary, and no human being experiences the world except in those terms. So that becomes, rather than some tangible external material world that's mechanical, for Kant, the touchstone, the source of knowledge, and the fact that we can have truth and science is this ideal structure of logical principles that gives rise to our experience of an ordered world. So Kant says, how is an experience of ordered, law-abiding nature possible? It's possible because the mind knowing it is logical and law-abiding. And so Kant does this transcendental move, which is the epistemological equivalent of the astronomical move that Copernicus made. But it's the inverse, because Copernicus kind of knocked humans out of the center of the universe, put us on a rock that's flying through space around the sun, And Kant's like, no, wait a minute. We as knowers are actually the source of all the structure of that world we think we're seeing out there. Now, that idealistic position is not where I would want to leave off. And I know I'm over time already, so forgive me if I go on for at least another minute. Kant gave rise to a new mode of philosophizing, where this opposition between human freedom and the determinism or mechanism of nature was clearly articulated, and it posed a problem to the generation of thinkers that came after him. These were the German idealists. Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Goethe in his own way was interacting with Kant as well. And all of these figures, I think they really invented what we have come to call integral philosophy, because they were trying to understand not just the universe as an object, but how it is that a subject like us came to be capable of knowing an object like that. So rather than the Newtonian view where we can explain the universe just by looking out there at the motion of objects through a geometrical space, the German idealists, following on in Kant's footsteps, begin to ask, well, what must be true of the mind that's behind all of that scientific knowing? What are the conditions of possibility making that scientific knowledge real? And what Schelling ends up doing, and my evolutionary panpsychism follows from his view, is saying that, look, we can start, as the idealists do, from this subjective position and say that we only experience the world as we are organized to experience it, as our sensory organs and our mental categories allow us to experience it. And at the same time, we have to ask the more realist question and the evolutionary question, which Schelling was one of the first evolutionary thinkers. He was, learning about geology, which was just beginning as a science, and the idea that the Earth was 6,000 years old was just beginning to be questioned. This was like around 1800, right? And so Schelling's realizing that, whoa, the whole universe is way older than the Bible told us. And so he's like, okay, some kind of evolution happens here. Rather than asking Kant's question, which is, Kant asks, what must the mind be like such that nature could appear to us in the way that it does? Schelling asks, what must nature be such that mind could emerge from it? So he asks the reverse question from Kant, right? So Kant asks, what must the mind be such that the appearance of a law-abiding nature is possible? And Schelling asks the reverse question, what must nature be such that mind could emerge from it? How is it that a knowing scientific consciousness could emerge out of this universe? That tells us something, Schelling argues, about the nature of that universe. And he ends up articulating an evolutionary account of the emergence of spirit out of nature, if you want, but he doesn't mean something supernatural. He means something quite specifically natural. But for Schelling, nature is not just a collection of already completed, finished products. For Schelling, nature is a process of creativity, right? Nature is an evolutionary process a process that's giving rise and emerging into ever new forms that have a deeper interior capacity to experience itself, to experience one another, to experience this evolutionary process. So rather than making the mind something separate from nature, Schelling says, no, nature itself was always a process of growth towards mind. And you might say, well, that's all I'm saying with emergence, but the difference here is, can consciousness and interiority in the whole left-hand side of the quadrants emerge out of what prior to that emergence was just the right-hand side of material surfaces colliding with one another? Schelling doesn't think so. Whitehead doesn't think so. I don't think so. And I don't think we need to be creationists to argue that there is some sort of interiority that goes all the way back. So I'll stop there. Sorry I went over. I'll hand it over to you, David.
I will just say first that our main purpose here is understanding and clarity rather than winning points. So I didn't feel a need to stop you either. If David needs to take a little extra time to make his position clear, that's totally fine. And David?
Yeah, I guess I'm like slightly tempted to see if I could get him to quickly say what his position is. And I know he said that he's an evolutionary panpsychist. and he says that he doesn't understand how the interiors would have emerged from nature. So I'm still trying to understand his cosmological position. Like, so is he a dualist, realist? Is he an idealist? Does he think that it's all happening, that all of nature is emerging in mind? Like, I still don't understand exactly what he thinks is primary. I've heard him say that creativity is primary, but when I ask him whose creativity, it doesn't sound like he's talking about anybody. He says it's like this non-personified. So I'm still like very unclear about what cosmological position is being taken. So I mean, if he wants to say a little bit more about that, I would be interested in giving him a little bit more time before I jump into my opening statements.
Okay, so I am not an idealist. I think so. You know, let me approach it this way. Schelling is often grouped with the German idealists, but many people have argued that he's not actually an idealist because of his view of the evolution of consciousness out of nature. It's not the nature that Newton was describing. It's a nature that's alive from the beginning. Not that it's a person. Creativity isn't personal. It's very specifically in this Whiteheadian mode of thought that I'm engaging with. It's very specifically not personal. It's impersonal. It doesn't belong to anyone. Okay? And I know that is a stretch because usually we're used to thinking of creativity in anthropocentric terms. Whitehead is a very non-anthropocentric thinker in the sense that he's trying to get us out of imagining that human beings are the only conscious, mental, sentient creatures in the universe, and that in fact, we're not that special. We're not that special at all. Experience is pervasive in this universe, and we're a particular species of it. But creativity as the source is not already personal. Like, personality is something that emerged in the course of evolutionary history. So that's the first clarification I'd want to make. And this isn't idealism because I don't think, you know, to put creativity at the beginning is to say there was no plan. There was not some God thinking about how it wanted the world to be and then deciding to create that world. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. So it's not God at the beginning. It's not Jehovah or Yahweh or some personalistic being. It is creativity, which I think a synonym for would be chaos, in the sense that there's no definite order yet. Order emerges in the course of evolutionary history. And I do, in my cosmological scheme, make reference to God, but not a God as a designer that exists before the universe. God is, so if we're going to offer any explanation for why there is something rather than nothing, why did anything come out of this creativity? Why is there cosmos and not still chaos? We have to invoke something.
I'm curious though, like, are you talking about dualism though? Or because here's where I'm confused, right? Because you're talking about these things like, you know, that the universe is alive, that there's this creativity, and you're talking about what's natural. But I'm not sure whether you're saying, okay, like reality is this living process, and like you're still saying like, okay, yeah, I am talking about idealism because it's all this you know, living process that's happening. Maybe it's not like there's some personified transcendent being or something like that, like a Christian version of idealism or something like that. But then, or are you talking about some kind of dualism where it's like there's reality and all of reality has some kind of interiority where there's an exteriority? Because I'm like, to me, there's three categories. There's realism, there's idealism, and there's dualism. Sometimes you could say that maybe dualism is the form of idealism, or I'm saying that maybe that you could be talking about reality, you know, like as itself as having this kind of dualistic nature. But I kind of feel like you have to put yourself in one of these camps, even if there's like a subcategory of one of these camps. Like, you're either a realist, you're an idealist, or you're a dualist. And I'm still trying to figure out which one you are.
I'm searching for a position that doesn't fall prey to either extreme, idealism or materialism. I think realism, I would call it organic realism, is a middle ground, which is to say that, no, I don't think reality emanates from a mind, but no, I don't think reality emerges from matter either. I think those are both extreme positions, and that the actual evidence, and when I say evidence, I don't just mean objectively measured scientific data. I mean also the evidence of our interior life as human beings. Like when I do cosmology, I'm also trying to understand how it is possible that on planet Earth, a species evolved that became capable of civilization, at least for a little while. You know, like where did this intelligence come from? That's part of the data that needs interpretation. And I don't think we give it a good interpretation when we say, oh, it was just an accidental emergence. I also don't think we do it justice when we say that, oh, well, there was some God before time and space that decided he wanted to create these little creatures he could torture. Neither one of those.
I wouldn't advocate for either one of those positions either.
So
I'm
tell
just
tell me about your position.
Okay, I guess I'll just start then.
Can I say something first, real quick?
Yeah.
Since we kind of jumped off the format, my idea now is the person presents their perspective, and then there's a round of questioning about that perspective, and then the next person presents their perspective, and there's a round of questioning about that, and then open free form. So before you jump into yours, are there any lingering other questions that you'd like to ask?
Oh, yeah. I mean, like, I feel like if we did it that way, the whole time it would just be me asking clarifying questions and we would get nowhere. And like, I've asked him this question like probably 10 times and I still haven't got an answer about it. And I still don't know what his answer is. Like, is he a dualist? I don't know. It sounds like he's saying that he's a dualist, but it also sounds like that he wants to act like the tangible reality is happening in consciousness. So I mean, that sounds like idealism. So I don't know what his position is. I could go on with my case and then we could come back around to it. But I feel like if I keep asking him questions, he'll keep answering, but what we won't necessarily get anywhere. I could be wrong. Like, cause I mean, do you understand my question, Matthew?
I do understand your question. And what I'm trying to do is offer a different frame for the possible positions that one can take. And I'm trying to I'm not a dualist. I don't think that there are two separate substances or two separate ontological domains.
That's my point. So it's like you would want to nest the physical reality in terms of interiors. Like you think that the physical world is happening
No. Here's what I'm saying, that the idea you have of the physical world and the idea you have of the psychological world or the realm of mind, I think these ideas are too abstract. Like, I would want to know, what do you mean by matter or exteriority? What do you mean by interiority? Because when I talk about experience, I'm not talking about something that's just inside somewhere. Experience has a private pole, a hidden dimension that's just inner, but it also has a public pole. There's an oscillation. Every experience implies an expressive aspect to it. There's no experience of the universe that's not also a component part of the universe that has an effect on that universe. And so I'm not a dualist in that I don't think that there's something called matter that is set apart from something called mind. I think we need to inhabit the universe where if we want to call it the physical world, then we have to recognize that physical, and let's draw it back to the original Greek sense of physis, which meant the growth of a plant, that there's some kind of inner life that unfolds and expresses itself. That's what physis means. There's nature comes from natality. It's a birth process, right? It's not just stuff in motion. And I know you are not saying it's just material stuff. So I'm happy to talk about the physical world as all that there is in this more original sense that the Greeks would have meant it, the ancient Greeks, that the physical world, it's alive. And maybe the mineral dimension is only minimally alive, and the plant realm and the animal realm becomes more lively. And then in the human being, there's this like active intellect that's like super cool. So there's gradations here, but there's no just empty inert matter that exists in some purely exterior quadrant or half of the quadrants. I think when we look at the quadrants, we're dealing with a heuristic. It's convenient for sorting and positioning different views. But when we're doing ontology, we need to understand how these aspects are part of a process that's integral. It's not, there aren't these separate boxes that reality exists in. There's some kind of dynamic evolutionary process going on, and we learned about it because of science, but it has religious significance, and religion needs to catch up to what science has revealed and understand God in a new way, given the scientific evidence. That's my cosmological position, I think. Hopefully that makes sense.
It doesn't make sense to me. Like, I think that every single person is talking about some kind of nesting, and I don't see you doing that, and so I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, you're saying that, I'm like, okay, so are you saying that? I don't know. It's like you're saying that it's not dualism because you're not talking about one nested in the other. You're saying they're like the same thing or something like that. That physical things are the same as. I mean, I just don't. I don't even get it. I think maybe from here I'll just go ahead and start, and then maybe we'll come back around.
That sounds fine.
Yeah, because I don't want to get bogged down. So I'm gonna start by saying that I appreciate Matthew for stepping up and stepping out there and putting his ideas and his concerns on the table, and for engaging in good faith with no like personal attacks and no bullshit. Like that's a great start, and I really appreciate it. Like in general, just the good faith debate and disagreement is a great place to start. And I appreciate that in his videos that he started by trying to say some places of agreement, and so I'm going to try to do something similar to that. I appreciate the fact that Matt is not down with bypassing of reality, and I appreciate the fact that Matt is happy to reject dogmatic creationism. He says he values interfaith dialogue, and I can tell that he likes poetry, so I think we have some stuff in common there. I'm an artist and a philosopher, and so I like to think about life in a very creative, artistic type thing as well. And like I'm all for like poetry, like life as a stage, things like this. Life is artistic. Life is creative. Yeah, I think that's great stuff. He says he values and understands science, that it's not just a fairy tale. So these are all great places to start, and it seems like we have some common ground to build on. I start out my talk on 2.0, indeed, like dismissing cosmological idealism, and in particular, I'm going after Wilbur here because Wilbur did the 1.0 version of integral, and he's got more of a Buddhist kind of dogmatic sort of cosmology and creationism. Not so much the Christian one, but I would say that they're similarly unfounded. But this is the reason why around cosmology, I end up bringing up emergentism, because I think that if emergentism is true and that consciousness doesn't go all the way down and back, which is a relative fact claim as opposed to something like an absolute truth claim, right? Because we can actually potentially get in and start to measure and correlate these kinds of things, as opposed to an absolute claim about the nature of reality, which is really hard to falsify and do science about. So I think in the same way that evolution debunks the creation myth of Abrahamic idealism, I think emergentism debunks the dogma of the Eastern idealism. But I consider myself to be a realist, and really ultimately, as I said in the video, these are conclusions that I think that we come to on the other side of point 3 and 4, which are pre-trans distinction and epistemic humility. In particular, in this case, I'm going to focus on the epistemic humility, but I think the pre-trans distinction is going to come into play. In particular, this idea of qualifying our poetry and being able to back up even our poetic claims. Because again, I think it does kind of all come back to epistemic humility and intellectual honesty in terms of founding these things. And in that regard, I probably don't think today is even the day to really make this about emergentism, because even if emergentism wasn't true, or you could poke a million holes in it and show that it doesn't stand up, that doesn't, at the end of the day, if you want to make a claim about how the universe is, you have to demonstrate that it's reasonable and that it's rooted in something and that you can actually back it up. And I think that just the fact that this is the dominant view amongst scientists shows that that they arrive at this conclusion through doing science. It's not like one position asserted by one person once, as like, and then we can just point to them and appeal to authority. Like, I'm not necessarily appealing to a personal authority. I'm appealing to what I would consider a trusted method of thousands of people working together to refine what we know as scientific knowledge over time, and that there are cross-disciplinary agreements around certain subjects. So even if we could say that there's holes in those theories or there's problems with it or something like that, I'm going to say that these people are doing good faith work with epistemic humility, and they're not like overstepping their bounds, and that it's a reasonable and valid theory. And in general, it's the theory that if you took any class on any relevant subject, this would probably be the view in which that you would be told. Now, again, like I'm saying, I don't think this is an appeal to authority. I think it's an appeal to a rigorous process. And I'm not saying that that's case closed, okay? Because I think that if I'm making a claim, the burden of proof is on me to back up that claim, just like it would be for anybody. And I do think that there will be a time and a place once I've put my positive case on the table to really get into the details of that. But the reason that we're having this debate in the first place, as Bruce said, and as you said, is that I have been critical of idealism. I don't think that it stands or it has, any validity or justification, be it evidence or logic on its side. And so I kind of think that if we're going to postulate a position, that we have to look into that. If you want to defend idealism, I think we should focus on that we should focus on seeing if there's a version of these ideas that you think can stand up to criticism. So let me say a little bit more. So you mentioned Kant, for example, and a lot of these German idealists, they start with awareness. They start with their perspective, and they say, like, you can't know anything out in the world except for through your senses, from your limited subjective perspective. This is their starting point, and I would agree with them. I think that phenomenology is the epistemic primary, or the consciousness is the epistemic primary. But I think that beyond that, there is a cosmological primary in which this awareness is nested. So the the context actually helps us to frame and know what awareness actually is, right? So I think there's actually, it's something like with epistemology, we would start with our experience, and then we would have to figure out ontology and like figure out what's happening in the world. And then through measuring things in the world and figuring things out, we develop theories, and then we can start to understand cosmology, which then informs what awareness is, right? So I think it goes awareness, and then knowledge is nested in that, and then through that knowledge, we can put our awareness in context. But I think what happens with idealism is they start from awareness, and then they have assumptions about what that awareness is, and then they nest knowledge in the context of that awareness, in the context of those assumptions, and then it just becomes circular reasoning where they reinforce what they originally thought about their awareness without ever really having rigorously put it in context in a way where they demonstrated and proved that that was the truth of the context of awareness, to be able to know what awareness really was in the first place. So I would say that we all start from this position of not knowing what awareness really is either. Not just not knowing what the world is, but not knowing what our awareness is or what consciousness is, and that we would have to do work to establish both. And what generally happens is that people from this view don't do any work to support their actual position. What they do is they talk trash about the materialistic framework, and then just think that if they can knock that one down, then their view stands as some kind of a alternative given. And I don't think that's the case. So that's why I'm saying I think even if you could poke all kinds of holes in emergentism or even knock it down, that you would still have to do the work of justifying your position. So that's why I guess I'm saying today that I'm not even that interested in trying to defend emergentism, because it's a little bit besides the point. The point is that the people who are claiming that idealists' views are valid and reasonable and logical don't have a foot to stand on. And so if you're going to support that position, I would like you to show that they do. And then if you want, on another day, I'll be in the hot seat, and you can try to come after emergentism, and that's all we'll talk about. But if you want to stand up in favor of German idealism, then yeah, maybe you should make valid cases to on their behalf to see if they stand, or even for your position, the evolutionary panpsychism. Like, I'm interested to see how you know, and if that's a valid theory, because to me, to be honest, I think what Whitehead is doing is this whole linguistic game, which is a house of cards that doesn't actually necessarily even correlate to reality. I think what happens is that we do have a good amount of knowledge about different levels of reality. So like, if here's Earth and like our normal plane of existence, like, we have a pretty good firm understanding of that. We've developed microscopes and telescopes to be able to start to understand levels down and levels above. And then our knowledge within these levels, below and above, has also informed our knowledge of what's better, understanding better what's going on our level. But also what I see happening, going back to this idea of trying to poke holes in science and materialism to justify the idealist view or something like this, is that they'll point to the places where our knowledge is the flimsiest to try and undermine places where our knowledge is the most firmly established. And again, I don't think this is ever really doing anything to actually establish the truth of their view. I think it all becomes like a sort of a solipsistic kind of game. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily what you're doing. I'm saying that this is the pattern that I've seen when arguing with idealists a bunch of times. And you don't even necessarily claim to be an idealist or a dualist. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily your thing, but yeah, I would like to see not just casting doubt or trying to poke holes in things that are established, but actually trying to define and qualify and validate, your view and see if it stands. Let's see. Do I have anything else to say? I think that's probably it for now. Oh, wait. Let me define some terms real quick, and then I'll pass it. Okay. When I talk, here's one of my main concerns in this conversation, is that I'm worried about how we might end up talking past each other, right? Because my understanding of of how reality works is different than yours, and we end up potentially using the same terms to talk about different things. So for example, like coming from a more emergentist perspective, like I would correlate consciousness to something like life happening at the level of like a cell or something. So I actually feel like that's very gracious to say that all living beings are conscious. So when I talk about consciousness, I'm not talking about sapience. I'm talking about any amount of sentience. I would want to extend consciousness. Like a lot of people like talk about proto-life and proto-interiorities or something like that. And to me, a lot of that is like pure semantics and kind of unfounded, without any kind of evidence. So I would make a distinction between consciousness and subjectivity, or sentience and sapience. And even within subjectivity, you can have potentially instinctive reactionary behavior all the way up to something like, metacognition or something like that. So just because, they're conscious in this regard, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're like conscious in terms of like enlightened or awakened or something like that. So to me, these are like three different levels of terms, ways that people would talk about consciousness or something like that. There's being a living being, there's subjectivity, and there's like enlightenment. And I think a lot of times these terms get conflated. And so I don't know if there is a common language that we can find together around this kind of stuff, or like places where we might agree to terms, especially because you're saying things that like creativity is the ground of being. I don't know whose creativity or what that means, or like that these drops of experience self-emerge out of it. I don't know what it means when we say self, or when we say experience in this context. Like I don't know how this relates back to reality, or like how we're saying that these things are experiencing, or even what this means. Like, to be honest with you, I don't know. I'm very confused about a lot of this. So if you have some definitions or some ways of parsing some of this apart, or explaining and justifying like how it seems like you're personifying these things, but maybe you're not, or I don't know. I think that's the end of my first statement. I think hopefully that helps in terms of giving some definitions or something.
Should I just launch in, Bruce, or I'll respond, and then I have some questions for David. Is that the idea?
Exactly, yes.
Okay. So thanks, David. That is helpful. Let me note some areas of agreement that I was excited about. So you were saying you agree with Kant that consciousness or awareness is epistemologically primary, but you think that there's also a cosmological primary. One of my questions for you is what is that? If it's not matter, what do you think is cosmologically primary? I know you've asked me that repeatedly. I've tried to answer, but I haven't really. I don't know what your cosmological primary is if it's not matter. So that's one question, and I'll repeat my questions at the end. But another area of agreement. So yeah, I think what we need, in attempting to articulate Schelling's position as an inheritor of Kant, Schelling was really emphasizing what you said, that we need to coordinate between and create a recursive feedback loop between this transcendental perspective that makes our experience or consciousness first, or primary epistemologically. We need to coordinate between that and this evolutionary perspective that says, well, there's an evolving universe out there that gave rise to us. And that view of us as an emergent product of a historical process of evolution, and the other view of us as transcendental subjects who come to know anything about this process based on the structures of our own mind, these need to be coordinated. We can't just dismiss Kant. I mean, if you want logical rigor and precision of argument and up-to-date understanding of mathematics and physics and biology as advanced as it could be in the 1780s, read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. So it's easy to dismiss Ken Ham or whoever other creationist, but if you read the idealists, they were as conversant as anyone else on the planet with the cutting edge of science in their day. And that's not to say that science hasn't advanced since then, but, and I know you're not dismissing these guys. I'm not saying that. I'm just trying to point out that there are ways of being an idealist who privileges transcendental subjectivity as the epistemological primary that are very sophisticated and that totally are conversant with physics and biology. So it's not an easily dismissed position. But I agree with you, though. I'm not an idealist. I agree with you. We need to coordinate that sense of epistemological primacy of our phenomenological experience with the fact that we emerged in the course of evolutionary history. So I think that's a point of agreement between us. We disagree on what that evolutionary process is and what may have emerged and what was sort of baked in, right? You think consciousness or sentience emerged with life, which is a very respectable position. Look, I would call it biopsychism. It's not panpsychism, because you think the psyche or consciousness or sentience emerged. I know I'm using a bunch of words, but sentience, you say it emerged with life. I've been in dialogue with a friend of mine and a colleague, Evan Thompson, for a decade. He's a collaborator with Francisco Varela, who died in 2001. They developed what's called autopoiesis and a whole school of thought called enactivism. It's basically the idea that the definition of life is autopoiesis, or self-production, which is more than just self-organization. It's the idea that a single cell is complex enough to give rise to a membrane that allows it to distinguish itself from an environment, to produce this little packet of negative entropy and to live, right? And that they think that when these molecules emerge into this cellular organization, an interior domain, they call it, of concern, and Varela actually did draw on Whitehead to call it a subject pole, emerges in the midst through the interplay of this complex chemistry. So they are biopsychists, and I think that's a very respectable position. I've been thinking with Varela and Thompson and their collaborators for a long time. I love that stuff. I've also been arguing with Evan about how there's a certain degree of ontological indetermination in this position, which is to say that if you say that sentience emerges with life and that before the first cell emerged, there was just neutral chemistry and physics, I think there's quite a gap there. It's not as severe as the gap as those who think consciousness emerges when neurons get complicated enough. You know, it's at least recognizing that, oh, life is different than physics and chemistry. And I agree with that. I don't deny emergence of more complex form, like cells and multicellular animals, and complex social linguistic animals like human beings. Like, these are emergent stages of evolution. All that I would criticize emergence for, and here's where, I'm not here to defend idealism. I'm here to integrate this epistemological primacy of our experience with this cosmological primacy of the evolutionary process that produced us. I'm not defending either position in isolation. I'm saying that they need to be coordinated and that we need to find some way of speaking that allows us to see the evolutionary process of nature as the expression of some sort of aim or desire, and Wilber calls it eros, and that unless you have that baked in, emergence doesn't make any sense, evolution doesn't really make any sense, and certainly the appearance of sentience all of a sudden because molecules started dancing in the right formation, it really doesn't make sense. And I know you don't want to get into emergence, but I mean, come on, you're grilling me on my position. I want to know, what is your view of the emergence of sentience in single cells? Does what emerges have any freedom to redirect the behavior of the physical cell that it is possessing, or that possesses it, or however you want to view it? Is there any downward causation of the sentience on the behavior of the cell? Or is consciousness just as, T.H. Huxley, a Darwinian in the 19th century, he called consciousness the whistle on a train. It's not actually involved in the locomotion process. It's just this extra sound that may as well not exist. It's just frosting on the cake. It looks pretty, but it doesn't do anything. What do you think? I mean, I know you were defending freedom, I think, so you must think consciousness, at least in human beings, later on up the evolutionary scale of complexity has some capacity to exert a causal influence on the behavior of our bodies. And if you believe that, I need you to unpack for me what exactly emergence is, because that sounds like dualism to me. That's one question. What is emerging? Consciousness or sentience that can control the body of the organism it belongs to? And then just to say about Wilber and integral 1.0, which integral 2.0 is a reaction to, I guess I would say that before Wilber, integral was already a thing, actually. And so to say that Wilber is integral 1.0 kind of erases, thinkers who were explicitly using the integral terminology, like Sri Aurobindo and John Gebser, first of all, but other thinkers like the German idealists who are already doing, what Wilber later came to call vision logic, complex dialectical thinking, not just holding multiplicity in mind, but being able to integrate multiplicity in these hierarchies of understanding and holistic complexity. Like integral in a more generic sense pre-exists Wilber. And so if we don't, I agree, we don't want to, Wilber
how are you defining integral in this context?
As
the word integral?
As the capacity for vision logic, the realization that human beings have evolved through a series of worldviews. Gebser had a whole, I don't know if you're familiar with Jean Gebser or Sri Aurobindo, but there wouldn't be a Ken Wilber without these guys. And they were explicitly calling what they were doing integral philosophy or integral yoga, integral thought. So we don't need to say that Wilber owned integral 1.0 such that we need to react with a 2.0 to upgrade Wilber. Integral was far vaster than, deeper and wider than just Wilber from the beginning, right? And so that also was part of what triggered me about your video, besides the attack on idealism. So I just wanted to throw that in there, but I think my two questions were clear. I can repeat them if you want.
You also asked him to name what his cosmological primary is.
Right.
Thank you, Bruce.
If not matter, what?
Yeah, I guess I'm with I think that, Einstein said that E equals mc squared. So all of matter is just energy and dynamic flux. So, I guess I'll go with energy as the cosmological primary, which, vibrating fast enough becomes matter. So
potential energy or kinetic? Because if you say energy, that sounds a lot like creativity. But anyways, I'll let you go on.
Yeah, you could qualify your creativity as energy, and I would be fine with it. If that's what you were poetically talking about, and
but we need to talk about what energy is. Like, what is energy?
Well,
remember I was talking about like vector feelings and stuff in our Facebook thread. Energy has a vector; it's going somewhere. And Whitehead talks about this, that there's an aim implicit in our notions of energy, in the sense that energy isn't just a static state like we used to think of matter as. Energy is a dynamic process. It has velocity. It's coming from somewhere and going somewhere else, right? So there's a sense in which energy is, I think, at least proto-teleological already.
I would not go there. I would say that is jumping to conclusions that aren't necessarily founded. Just because there happens to be energy doesn't mean that anyone intended it, or that it itself intends to go somewhere.
I didn't say anyone intends anything.
Well, then what do you mean by telos? Doesn't that imply some like purpose or like intended direction?
So Aristotle defined two types of teleology. One that comes from the outside, that's more like the design paradigm that both atheists like Richard Dawkins and creationists like Ken Ham are obsessed with the design paradigm, this notion that form or the shape of an organism is imposed from the outside. The theist creationist says God imposed the form, and the atheist neo-Darwinian says that natural selection imposed the form. But the idea is that organisms are designed, whether through natural selection or through divine selection. I think we need a different paradigm entirely that's not based on design, but that's based on a purpose that is immanent or that is more like a creative groping and experimentation than it is like something pre-programmed in advance, right?
Right.
So the aim is sort of like initially a blind striving after just more intense experience. It's not after some specific...
But you're describing it in a personified way, though. Blind striving after experience. That's like a personification. So I mean, like, it sounds like instead
I
of...
hope persons are capable of more than blind striving. I mean, it's kind of pre-personal, I think.
No, but I'm saying that striving implies that there's a being who's intending to do something. And I'm wondering how you're starting from that conclusion and end up because I mean, like, if you said it's energy, right, there's no personification in that. But when you say that the energy is intending, or that it's striving, or that it's being creative, or that it's experiencing, you're taking human concepts about personal experience and applying that terminology to inanimate objects. And I'm wondering how you're justifying that.
I'm justifying it because I cannot understand how agency, as I experience it as a human being, and as I witness it in other human beings, I don't understand how agency at the complex level that human beings possess it is possible in a universe that is otherwise, whether outside of humans or outside of life, devoid of agency, utterly, completely devoid of even the mere hint of a striving or an erotic lure for more complexity. I don't understand how we can get to what we have unless it was in seed form from the beginning. And I'm asking you to explain how emergence accounts for how agency appears in what is otherwise, I mean, I don't want to caricature materialism, but it's not agential stuff. It's just...
Right. So you're saying that, if I can just repeat back to you what I think I just heard you say, is that you're saying that you assert agency at the beginning because you can't understand how agency would emerge. And so you decide that it must have been there from the beginning because you don't know how it would work otherwise. Is that right?
Because I've never even heard a potential theoretical mechanism that might explain how agency or consciousness emerges from inert matter.
So yes, that is what you're saying.
Yes.
That you postulate agency at the beginning because you don't understand how it would work otherwise.
Yes.
Okay, that's great.
Help me understand.
Well, let me deal with your other points before I try to explain that. So what is emerging freedom and integral as vision logic? So I would say I think that the first stage of vision logic is actually green, and so they're able to look at all this complexity and, like, potentially hold contradictory ideas, but not in a consistent way. Like, I think that it's only at the mid and late stage vision logics where you start to actually get some healthy forms of integration. Mm-hmm. So I think that deals with that. What is emerging? Is it freedom? This is your question. So let me see if I can. I think it's a good question. The question of freedom. And this is actually something that Alyosha wanted me to ask you, like, if you believe in free will and what your relationship is to that. But before I pass it off and ask you that, I'll try and answer your question about freedom. My technical position that I have around free will versus determinism is I call myself a semantic compatibilist, which basically just means usually compatibilism is a form of, like, trying to find a middle position between these two different ideas. And the reason I say that I'm a semantic compatibilism is because I think that both first and second person ways of talking about your experience, as well as third person ways of talking about your experience, are both poetically valid, right? So for example, if I say, I want to go to the store, you want to come with me? That's like a first person and second person way that we normally talk about our experience, Now, when science talks about things, they usually talk about things in a deterministic way, like this caused this, caused this, caused this, like billiard balls, right? And that they would say, oh, the reason that you want to go to the store is because you're out of the things you need to make dinner, and you want this food because you crave it, and so you're going to go. And I think both ways of talking about our experience are valid. I think probably, as you know, they're both valid types of poetry, but in general, I would probably think that the scientific deterministic perspective is probably more accurate, while the first and second person ways of talking are maybe more useful. And I think that there's a problem with something like free will coming online, because there is nurture coming up from the bottom, which has us acting in these instinctive reactionary ways. And then there's cultural conditioning coming down from the top, which is programming us to act in particular ways. And I don't really think that it's really possible to escape our nature or our conditioning, and to get some kind of view or perspective from nowhere in which to act. So it's a complicated question. I think it's hard to say that there is something like freedom, although I do think that definitely if we decide to be creative and hold a meaning, and even if it's determined and like a part of, like what would you say, like given fuel by our intrinsic reactionary nature, maybe we're motivated in a sense by that, and it's expressed through some kind of cultural conditioning and ways of thinking, that we can definitely will things, I guess, and change reality. Like I still think that ethics is a viable project, that we should still encourage people to try to be good, even if there's even if just doing that is cultural conditioning, I guess, is what I'm saying. So I don't know. I think it's confusing when we talk about free will because of semantics, because we are like basically trying to talk in two different linguistic systems at once, and those linguistic systems are not necessarily compatible. So I guess that's confusing, right? Because I'm saying that I'm a compatibilist, but what I'm saying is that first and second person ways of talking about life and our experience are not compatible with third person ways of talking about our experience, even if they're both valid in a particular way. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope that it does.
Well, it helps me, I think, understand your position more. And, earlier I was talking about emergentism, the idea that consciousness emerges from matter, having these two different possibilities. And it sounds like your compatibilism, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like a form of epiphenomenalism, in the sense that you're saying, well, we have these ways of talking as if we were free, and, that can be useful. And I wonder how it's useful if you're saying that actually ontologically, like in reality, it's just deterministic mechanism. It's the playing out of physics and chemistry and then some material conditioning of, like a Marxist analysis of society or whatever, that we're ultimately shaped by all of this, even if we have this way of talking ourselves into believing that we're free. And I guess it makes us feel better if we talk that way, even though in reality we're not free. I mean, is that uncharitable, or is that kind of what you're saying?
No, I don't think that's uncharitable. I think that's a reasonable way of trying to unpack what I'm saying. Like, for example, I do think that we could create a conscious AI, or at least that if we created, that if we worked on computers enough, that they could get advanced enough to the point as which they would be as good as conscious. And that basically, I think that, I do think that consciousness is an epiphenomenon, like an emergent property of matter nested in matter. You could say that that's a type of dualism, but I don't think it's like a cosmological dualism. So maybe it's more of like an ontological emergent type of dualism or something like that.
Okay. So I'm glad that we can agree. I mean, so if it were, I would say that if your position was actually dualism, that then there might be some way for consciousness to freely involve itself in the behavior of the body. Whereas I'm saying your position is epiphenomenalism, in that something like consciousness emerges, but it has no ability to change what's going on. we just talk ourselves into thinking we have the ability to change what's going on. And it's important, you're saying, to maintain that illusion for our well-being, our psychological well-being or something.
Well, I think it's complicated because on one hand, you know, like when we're talking about freedom and ethics and, you know, all of these, I guess, things that are potentially related to the well-being of conscious creatures and experience in the world, we have a particular programming language about that. You know, like for example, if you had like, this is why I bring up the computer thing, right? Is because you could have like a software language that in the context of the game of the software, it works in a particular different, I don't know, linguistic style that's not necessarily compatible with the ways of thinking about the hardware or something. Like hardware and software languages are different, and to the extent to which they can, like, okay, but I do think, okay, that you could build a computer, right? That hypothetically, eventually you could build a computer, I guess is what I'm saying, that like could be technically conscious or something like this, and that it could potentially work on itself, you know, and then you would have something like a software, you know, being conscious enough to refine its hardware or something like that. So like, I think you said something about like, you know, would this interiority be able to have an effect on the world? And yeah, within the context of its programming, it is able to have an effect on the world. But I mean, it is programmed by something in the world to be able to react in that kind of a way.
So
does that make sense?
Consciousness is software programmed by the world, by the material world. And consciousness has no ability to rewrite its own programming, right? Because that would be like some intelligence rewriting the laws of nature, right? So that's not possible.
Ask me that again.
Well, so I'm just trying to navigate, I think, the quandary that we get in when we think about consciousness as something that emerges from something material, where we have to decide whether the way that we imagine ourselves to be free is a reality that can somehow affect the material world that we suppose we emerged out of. And you seem to be saying, it's almost like you're saying we're stuck with the illusion that we have freedom, but science tells us that it is an illusion, but we should keep the illusion going anyway because it's useful.
Well, yeah, there's a game that we're playing together, let's say, as a society, right? Because, okay, so I think that it's one thing to say that, like, in part of this, like, emergent property of consciousness, or like emergent process of consciousness. It's one thing to say that subjectivity comes online, right? That's an aspect of it. But I think there's also like what really becomes part of the software in there comes from a culture, comes from like being introduced and indoctrinated into the game as it is. So it's not just a matter of having the capacity for subjectivity. There also needs to be programming, because for a self to emerge, you need words and language and a concept to be able to have a self, to be able to have an experience as a self, like this is happening to me. So I think that's like why it's a little bit confusing with a lot of these things, is because it's not like there's an on switch really for anything. It's like, even when we're talking about like cells and stuff like that, like I've seen, there's like a really good TED Talk called The Line Between Life and Not Life, right? Where this dude, he plays with all of these, what he calls proto cells and stuff like that. And he starts to basically take different chemicals and different things and put them together, you know, in the lab to see if he can build life, basically, right? Build like the basic versions of cells and stuff. And I mean, you can see that he basically does this. He can come up with little proto cells that will have like some of the attributes of life, like locomotion, or the a cell body, membrane, the ability to interact with its environment and all these things. But I mean, it pretty much looks like it's just like basic chemistry. Like these protocells, they like do one thing and they're done. And like, that's all they do. But then if you like put them in environments together, sometimes they'll like merge, and then like a new cell will come out of it that has the two properties of the previous protocells. It's kind of amazing to see, and I mean, I guess you could be tempted to want to anthropomorphize these things, but it also like, and I mean, it looks like they're doing cell stuff when they're active, but it's just chemicals. So I mean, like when I look at that, like it seems like, okay, wow, well this makes sense. It's like chemistry, but you can see how it starts to be the basic stuff for what life is. And I think, if you follow this thread, if you look at the different places where it looks like the transitions might start to happen, I think what it is that it's not like an on switch. It's like a part of it starts to come online, and then that mixes with other ingredients, and then you start to get something like subjectivity. Like, for example, I think that you could have like a biological organism that evolved the capacity, yes, to have subjectivity, but that doesn't mean that it like has the actual programming in place to give it subjectivity. Like, for example, like a baby might have a phenomenological experience, but it takes time for it to learn concepts, for it to be able to get a concept of a self, right? So there's like stages of buildup in between. It's not like the stuff just comes online. And it seems like we do kind of understand the steps along this process. So, I mean, it makes sense to me when I look at it. Like, it seems like it makes sense. I'm curious if you have any other like justifications or validations for asserting agency all the way down and back, besides just that you don't understand how emergentism could work. Have you done anything to try to falsify that or justify it? Because like, again, when I look at the steps of this process, I think that we could come to conclusions about what different levels, what the capacity of these different levels are, based on like looking at their behavior or something like that. And when we look at these like really, really simple stuff, it doesn't look like they do have any kind of form of agency at all. It looks like it's just stuff. So I don't know why you think it has agency. Like, is there any way of trying to justify that besides just asserting it or falsify it or something?
Sure. So I think you asked me earlier what I think about freedom, and I appreciate your response. It helps me understand where you're coming from better. So I can answer that question about how freedom might be possible, because I do think I have a stronger position than you on freedom. I think we are free, not like pure libertarian freedom to do whatever we want. Of course, we're conditioned by our culture, by our society. I can't sprout wings and fly out the window, even if I want to. It's not like that kind of freedom, but I think from moment to moment, we're able to assert some degree of agency that allows us to affect the course of events. How is that possible? And I think that trying to answer that question might help me provide maybe another angle of approach to why I don't think emergence can account for consciousness. So, the whole problem of freedom and determinism comes from a particular view of nature and a doctrine that sometimes is called the causal closure of nature, which is, the idea that, you can talk about it in various ways, that everything has a cause, and that science is in the pursuit of explanations in causal terms that are exhaustive, and that there's no room in science's deterministic picture of a law-abiding physical universe for anything like freedom. There might be room for chance when you start to talk about quantum probabilities, but randomness It's not the same as freedom, so that doesn't help us. But there's a tradition in the philosophy of nature. It goes back to Schelling and some American philosophers like Charles Saunders Peirce. He developed a whole notion of semiotics. He's not a panpsychist, but he's his position is, you could call it pan-semiosis. Semiosis and semiotics is the study of meaning and sign interpretation. And Peirce would describe it not as interiority going all the way down, but as sign interpretation going all the way down. Very fascinating thinker. Point is, like Whitehead, he thought that what we call physical laws are really habits that emerge, like everything else, in the course of evolutionary history. Physical laws are not just eternally imposed, as if they were fixed from the beginning of time. That's how physics sometimes imagines it, when it's working in this design paradigm that I was hating on earlier. Physical law is imagined as if it were just a code written into the universe at the beginning of time, when I think actually a more evolutionary way of understanding law, a less idealistic way even and theological way of understanding physical law, is to see laws as more like habits that emerge in the course of evolutionary history. And that the physical world, because of the degree of creativity or freedom that can be expressed in the behavior of protons and electrons and atoms and stars and galaxies even, very minimal degree of freedom can be expressed. This level of physical existence tends to repeat what just occurred as it unfolds through time. There's not much innovation. There's not much capacity to go against just the inrushing like feeling of the past, the pressure of the past. It's determining everything, right? So it seems law-like, and it's law-like enough that we can use math to describe what's going on. There's a high degree of repetition at that level, but as soon as you get to life, Gregory Bateson, the philosopher and cognitive scientist, used to use the example of like, if you kick a rock, you pretty much know what's going to happen. You might stub your toe, but the rock, if it's not too big, is going to roll down the hill or whatever, and it's kind of just a physical process. But if you kick a dog, it depends on the history of that dog. It depends on its interior experience, its mood, its personality, how it will respond. I'm not advocating that we should kick animals, but it makes the point that there's more capacity for novelty of expression, more capacity for freedom as you move up the evolutionary hierarchy of complexity. And so rather than this opposition between deterministic physical law and apparently free human consciousness, I think we can, in a more evolutionary way, understand how freedom evolves, and greater capacities for the expression of freedom emerge in the course of time. And when we're talking about the physical world, I think it's, again, just to reiterate, it's actually a more idealistic and theological interpretation to say that there are physical laws that are fixed for all time. Like, where did those come from? It's, I think, more productive, more naturalistic, more evolutionary to imagine that law is actually just widespread habit, and that in the course of evolution, more novelty becomes, organisms evolve that become capable of more novelty. And humans seem to be especially free in that we can imagine utopias and strive to realize them. So yes, I affirm human freedom. I don't think it's in opposition to some mechanistic determinism in nature. I don't think nature is a machine at all that has some sort of causal closure. I think nature is a creative system. Nature is an evolving process. It's not a deterministic machine. It's more organic than it is mechanistic. And in that context, I think human freedom is real and makes more sense.
I mean, I don't think that anybody who actually had a deterministic view would be convinced by that, because if you're saying that we can try and we can actually affect the world, they're going to be like, well, you're doing that for a reason. You're doing that because you're motivated by your natural impulses, and it's influenced by cultural conditioning. And that if you do anything, there's probably a pre-given reason for it. Like you said, even if you kick that dog, like it's going to do what it's going to do, either because it's naturally motivated to do it, or it has some kind of past history that makes it react in a certain kind of way. Whatever it does, it's going to do that for a reason. And I mean, I guess this is why it gets into the semantics a little bit, because if you're determined to talk about things as if in terms of cause and effect, in the context of that way of talking about things, you're never going to be able to get at freedom, because there's always going to be just I mean, this is why I'm saying, like, I think I'm more of a semantic compatibilist, because basically when people talk about determinism like this, they just seem like they're dedicated to a type of third person description, which I don't necessarily think is helpful. But at the same time, you know, in the context of the kind of conversation that they are having, it's not like they're wrong. Yeah, the dog did scream because it's got biological natural factors at play, or it did like pee itself or like attack because of its past, you know, conditioning or whatever, or something like that. What would you say to that, Matthew?
Oh, I totally agree. I couldn't convince a determinist that they have freedom. I mean, that's something that we each have to discover for ourselves.
Okay, fair enough. Well, do you think that you can justify this this idea of agency down and back without saying that you don't understand emergentism, or without trying to say that the ideas of science are theological or something like this? Because what it kind of sounds like you're doing to me is like the same thing I was saying about idealists before, or like, you know, the guys who talk about the primacy, like we spoke about, you know, it's like they want to start with awareness, and then they talk about naive realists, right, who just take their senses for granted and think the world is just how they perceive it, right? But then I think what actually ends up happening is that then these people who want to say that awareness and phenomenology are primary end up taking that for granted, end up having a type of naivete about what that is and a pre-given assumption, and then they talk about scientific knowledge as a type of belief system, because we really can't know that, because really all we have is phenomenology. And they actually get stuck in circular reasoning, assuming that their pre-given assumptions are true without actually going through knowledge. And like for example, like, you know, like here I'm saying like, well, you don't understand emergentism, and you're kind of like poo-pooing scientific laws as if they're a belief system. And you want to talk about it as habits, and you want to talk about agency going all the way down and back. And it just seems like you're committed to talking about it that way, but you haven't done anything to actually establish that that's actually the truth. And I'm wondering, like, can you use knowledge about the world that you gain to support this view and validate it? Or are you just being like, oh, well, our knowledge is not really that trustworthy, I like to think about it this way? Because like that just seems to me like you're begging the question, and it's caught in circular reasoning, and you actually haven't established it or proved it. In the same way that like it wouldn't be just okay for a naive realist to just take his thing as a given. I don't really think that it's okay for us to just take our assumptions about the nature of reality as being having agency as a given either. I think you would have to establish that.
Yeah, well, let me just clarify. I'm not poo-pooing physics as a belief system. I'm just saying that physics, given the evidence of the last century of, and I guess if we want to include Darwin, you know, century and a half of scientific discovery, I think the science that Newton inaugurated needs a new metaphysics, because the universe is not the mechanistic clockwork system that Newton thought it was. And that's not in opposition to science. That's a result of taking evolution seriously, not just on the biological realm, but for the whole universe as an evolutionary process. It's a time developmental process. That's what we have learned scientifically. And quantum and relativity theories totally destroy the old materialistic notions. We talk in terms of energy now and quantum potentials. And let's start with energy. You know, energy was not content to remain in its potential form. Let's say, let's just use the Big Bang, the general theory of inflationary cosmology, and talk about this as an evolutionary process. I think it's one of the best theories we have, even though, strictly speaking, there's a lot of, it's more like a Rube Goldberg machine. It's a model of models, and there's all sorts of contradictory evidence. But I'm willing to say it's the best model we got going, so we may as well run with it for now. We begin with energy. It wasn't content to remain, the universe began, we won't get into how that might be possible, but it began and it started as just a soup of electrons, like a plasma. And then quarks and protons and neutrons solidified, and then the first atoms emerged. And the way Whitehead describes this process, rather than just a bunch of abstract laws playing out their information processing program, he's like, oh no, okay, these electrons, protons, neutrons, he calls them primate organisms. They are themselves highly complex, self-organizing systems in comparison to the plasma or the quantum void that preceded them. And then these protons, neutrons, and electrons, he says, they enter into a symbiotic relationship with one another when the first hydrogen atoms emerge. And that this organism, the hydrogen atom, by bringing together these formerly separate parts, it's an emergent product of those relationships, and it has new capacities that weren't present in just the electrons, protons, and neutrons. And then that process repeats itself as hydrogen atoms coalesce into stars. Stars are an emergent product of atoms. Much more complex stuff going on with stars. And Whitehead is imagining this whole, I don't want to go through the whole story, you know it well. Whitehead's imagining this process of cosmological evolution as a process of organisms in an ecosystem co-evolving with one another, where there's a clear tilt toward complexity. And plenty of physicists have run the calculations in terms of probabilities to say that in only 14 billion years, for this universe to have gotten to the state of complexity that it is in, at least on this planet, highly improbable event. Now, I'm not trying to make some God of the gaps argument. Indeed, I don't think that this thing was designed by a God, but I think there was an intrinsic urge toward emergent evolution of higher capacities for experience, deeper capacities for experience. That, hydrogen atoms had a deeper capacity for experience than was present in the plasma, and stars had a deeper capacity for experience than was present in the atoms, and on to multicellular, to single cells and multicellular life in humans.
I don't mean to interrupt. I understand that, Whitehead postulates this stuff. But what I'm asking, this, you said there wasn't you talk about the beginning of the world with this intrinsic urge. I'm asking, how are you justifying this assertion that there's agency all the way down and back? And, you've pointed to probability here. You've pointed to Whitehead. The probability thing, the what are the odds thing, I don't find that to be a very convincing thing in general. What are the odds that that my pin was going to land right there? It's well, it's going to land somewhere. I don't know. So it's
well, fair
what
enough.
are the odds? I don't know. I never like the what are the odds kind of argument. But I'm wondering how this is my question, not what's the story, but how do you justify it? And how do you prove it's true? How is this not just a house of cards where it just asserts agency all the way down and back? How do we test it and prove it and know that it's right?
Well, because we're here. I mean, what I think you're putting the burden of justification on my position, and I accept that challenge and will do my best. But at the same time, you were unwilling initially to even go into emergentism. You were content to say, this is what most scientists, some version of this is what they will say. But I don't actually, let's say the question of how the universe emerged from nothing, if there was a Big Bang, the only explanation I've ever heard for that is it just happened.
Well, that's actually, I mean, you should look into it more, because a lot of cosmologists don't think the Big Bang is the beginning. They think that it's either, you know,
Sure.
some kind of a bouncing, collapsing in on itself and expanding, or that maybe the Big Bang was the other side of a black hole and the universe is recycle or something like that, since there's black holes in the middle. So I mean, like,
or this is one universe in a multiverse, and every other infinite universe, or there's infinitely many other universes, and they don't have life.
We could say we're agnostic about that. You know what I mean? And when I said that, I didn't want to defend emergentism, it was because I think that we could probably agree that the people who come to these conclusions are coming to these conclusions with intellectual honesty, and that they're making a rational argument and pointing to evidence, and like there might be gaps in that evidence, but I would like to think that we could probably all agree that there is at least a reasonable argument behind this stuff to try and justify it. And I mean, like I said, I'd be glad in the future, like I try to make like a ground up case for emergentism, starting from this phenomenology as the epistemic primary, establishing other minds, peer review, science, and building up to this thing from nothing. But I don't see you justifying your fundamental assumptions. Like, I'm fine to start with nothing and be like, okay, we don't know what consciousness is. We'll start from I think, therefore I am. I have no clue about what anything is in the world. All I know is that I exist. And I can start from there and build up to the conclusion that I come to. But I think what's happening is you're starting from an assumption and then just asserting it, and you get caught in circular reasoning, but you haven't backed up your fundamental claims.
I'm just trying to give an account of cosmogenesis that allows me to understand how me and you and Bruce came to exist. And I think that I'm doing my best to be intellectually honest about what the possibilities here are. And I grant that the emergentist perspective has a lot of good reasons going for it. And, you know, I have and continue to be in dialogue with scientists and philosophers who take emergence seriously. And I value the intellectual exchanges that we have. But as a metaphysician, as I said earlier, it seems to me to be ultimately unsatisfying ontologically to say that consciousness emerged at some point along the evolutionary path, because given the epistemic priority of our consciousness, as we both agree to, I don't even know how to begin imagining a theoretical mechanism to explain how that consciousness could emerge from something that was just material surfaces colliding. I can't even imagine the theory, much less like trying to test the theory. And so I don't know if you can explain what the theoretical mechanism is here. I've read a lot of these emergentists, scientists of various disciplines and philosophers. I've never encountered an actual theoretical mechanism to explain how consciousness or sentience even emerges, whether we're talking about consciousness at the level of a human brain or sentience at the level of a cell. How does that happen? I have never heard a convincing account of that.
Well, I mean, I can send you some videos about it, and maybe you can tell me if they're convincing, but I'm asking you if you can justify postulating agency all the way down and back. Like, can you justify that?
My justification would be to say that the fact that there is something rather than nothing suggests that there is a will to exist, and that will to exist might not be a deliberating divine intelligence that planned all of this in advance. I think it's more like a Nietzschean or Schopenhauerian will that's like involved in the evolutionary process and striving for consciousness. It wasn't conscious in the beginning, you know, and so.
And how did it know to strive for consciousness? And why are we saying that? I mean, it
didn't know where it was going. It didn't know where it was going.
Is this just a word game? Like, is there a way that you test the ways that your assumptions line up to reality? Can you or is it just like, well, I don't know how it could be another way. I really like the way that this looks.
Well, one of the ways I test it is pragmatically. And so for me, pragmatically, your position on human freedom is just a word game, basically. I think that
it's a qualified word game, though. Like
sure.
I don't just assert it. Like I would test that. Like, okay, here's a test.
Well, my
like,
test, yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I think that if that were adopted in a widespread way by people, that it would probably lead to a lot of cultural decay and nihilism and breakdown of civil society.
That's about useful as opposed to true. We're talking about truth, not usefulness.
I think that it's more useful to say that freedom is a reality and that we can participate in the formation of society with one another, be held accountable for our actions, have legal systems that actually achieve some semblance of justice, and so on. And I think we need a cosmology wherein it's possible to take our own freedom seriously, not as just a word game, not as a qualified word game, but as a real actor in the world. And in order to take my human freedom seriously, I don't want to be a dualist. I think dualism is incoherent. I want to be able to justify the reality of human freedom in the context of a universe that could have given rise to it. And I don't understand how a merely material universe could have given rise to sentience or consciousness or freedom.
How is this any different than a Christian saying something like, I don't want to live in a world that isn't created by God, where, there's not a divine plan and I'm not going to get to go to heaven? Like, it sounds like wishful thinking. Like, it doesn't sound like you're being like critical and trying to falsify your view. It sounds like you're saying that I want to believe this so that way I can think about things like this because I think that that's useful. And that's a different thing than making a claim that something is true because you have a rigorous epistemology to try and back up your claims.
I'm trying to justify the possibility of civilized human life. And part of justifying it means is coming up with a scientifically grounded, I hope, cosmological context within which human civilized life makes sense. If, so it really matters how we describe the universe. And I think the Christian way of describing the universe based on some denial of death and wish for an afterlife is not actually conducive to civilized life.
Sure, it's problematic, but how is your view more grounded and true?
Well,
not just useful.
Because I think the best account we can give of the scientific evidence that we have accumulated is that the universe is an organic evolutionary process that has aim and value built into it, such that the whole point is the achievement of value. And I think, yes, that's an assertion, but so is the assertion that it's just matter, obeying blind mechanical laws. That's an assertion. We can create models, and the history of science is the process of the creation of models that are mechanical and deterministic, and we test those. But
I think you're kind of retreating into relativism and creating a flatland here, where you're just like, everybody's making assertions. It's like, no, these people over here are qualifying all their terms and like making a nuanced argument that's supported in sound, and you're not. Like, you're just asserting it. And then when I ask you, how do you justify agency all the way down and back? You say, well, I like it because it seems like it's coherent with how I like to think about things. But I'm asking you, like, is there a way that you could be proven wrong? Is there a way that you could be falsified? What would that take? Like, and do you think that, do you think that's good enough? Like, in terms of like,
I think the proof against my position would be that human civilization continues to spiral into a dystopian nightmare where we're more and more controlled by media technologies and less human as we used to think of ourselves. I think.
So on your view, evolution and humanity have to be going somewhere and continue to be going somewhere. And if we're, for example, on a collision course with the Andromeda galaxy, and that this is actually the second law of thermodynamics is actually true, and this is just a tiny little pocket where complexity and evolution is happening for a little while until that's done too, and then it all winds down. Like that debunks your view then, yeah, if that's the case?
No, not necessarily. I mean, it could be that the depth of meaning and conscious life that's achieved in this planet, on this planet, is, even if it's a tragic form of beauty that is achieved, it still has cosmic significance, I would say, in a way that's not the sort of significance a Christian gets from their afterlife, but the sort of significance that I would want to postulate would be that we get to contribute in some way to an evolutionary process. And, you know, I don't deny the second law of thermodynamics. I don't deny that even if human beings get their act together and are able to steer clear of the iceberg, I don't deny that, you know, eventually the sun's gonna run out of atomic fuel and expand. And
so in what sense is the dystopia a falsification? I don't understand.
Well, because I think the way that value accretes in the history of the universe isn't necessarily just about how long we continue. You know, there's a level of value that can be achieved and a form of beauty that can be achieved that even if we pass away, I think there's still value in the achievement. And
to who?
Well, this is where Whitehead's process theology comes into the picture. And, you know, you could say that this is wishful thinking and psychologize it, but I think there are cosmological grounds for having some concept of God that does some work, some explanatory work. It's not a transcendent designer God in Whitehead's case. But
I wouldn't even necessarily have to go to the psychological thing and say that it's just wishful thinking. I think it's circular reasoning, and it's unfounded. It has no attempt at falsifying itself.
From a rational perspective, transrational thought could appear to be irrational. So I get the pre-trans fallacy, but it works both ways. So when we talk about God in a transrational way, the rational person's going to mistake it for creationism.
Yeah, but you're not qualifying your terms in a way that cash out with reality. So it's not like valid poetry that I can then, it's not like I'm saying, oh, I'm talking about agency, but really I'm talking about energy. No, you are making a literal rational claim about agency. This isn't transrational poetry. This is a literal fact claim that you're making about the nature of reality. And so you have to back that up reasonably. You can't just retreat into poetry. Like poetry, if it doesn't cash out in a way that shows to be like in a way that means something, then it's not really poetry. It's just nonsense and word salad, right? Like, I mean, you would agree with that, right? Like if my poetry doesn't cash out, then I'm just over here saying shit.
Yeah. So, you know, Whitehead has a critique of romantic poetry because poets like John Keats and Wordsworth, to some extent, like they didn't take science seriously enough from Whitehead's point of view. Okay. You know, like John Keats was really upset at the physicists for unweaving the rainbow and like, how dare you quantify this beautiful natural world that we inhabit and value from our subjective point of view. So yeah, mere poetry doesn't help us explain the nature of reality. However, there's another way of reading the Romantics, and Whitehead goes here actually as well when he's done critiquing them, to say that, look, when we do science, we're looking for an account of the world that is satisfying to our intellect, it's satisfying to our sensory experience, and that in some ways satisfying to our need for justification, a justification that the world makes sense and that we exist for a reason. And so when we're doing science, every science has its own jargon that, you know, you need to be initiated into and become a member of the community of the adequate to even begin to do that.
But that stuff is cashed out and like qualified reasonably. Like science is doing poetry. It is using poetry, but it's
qualifies not poetry. It's math. I mean, I'm
math
saying
is poetry too, because it's just human symbolism, but it's symbols to try and talk about things. So, I mean, the
Yeah.
question is, do your symbols cash out? Like, 1 means something, 2 means something, 3 means something, equals means something. Like, all of those things have a specific definition. And
Well,
then at the end, there's a proof where it's like, if
mhm.
this symbol means 1 and this symbol means 1 and 1 plus 1, if all those symbols mean something, then it equals 2, which means something. But if we change the value of the symbol 1, then it wouldn't equal 2 anymore. So it's like it has to
Whitehead and
be
Russell,
qualified.
Whitehead and Bertrand Russell worked together on the Principia Mathematica in the first decade of the 20th century, and they tried to prove over the course of 500 pages that 1 plus 1 equals 2. They wanted to really show why that is the case, and they couldn't do it, actually. So math, as clear as and precise as it can be, is not that easy, actually, to ground. Mathematics, they tried to logically ground it. It couldn't be done. It couldn't be done. And then Gödel came along later and logically proved that it couldn't be done. So there's a way in which this, I'm not saying logic and math aren't really important tools, but they have limits themselves. And what I am searching for in the context of cosmology is, yes, to be scientifically literate. And, I really love science. I want to learn as much as I can. I respect it deeply. I don't always agree with the way that scientists popularize their own work, but what I'm really looking for here is not just a scientific description. I want to find a way of, again, justifying the civilized phases of human existence. How is it that we came to be conscious human beings with science and morality and democracy and all these things we value? What must the universe be such that we could emerge out of it? And what kind of account can we give? And what kind of story can we give? What kind of poetry can we articulate that will allow us to make sense of our existence here meaningfully as a description, but also as a prescription, so that we feel like we belong here and like we have something to contribute to this process?
Yeah, but when I ask you about how you know about that, and then I ask you to qualify it, instead of demonstrating that you can justify it reasonably, instead you say things like laws of science are more like theology, and like there's science is limited and math is limited. And then so it's like you talk about the limits of these things, and you say that they're like, they're partial, but then like you don't like, then you just like go on to then say, well, I like this. And man, it really just seems like you have a house of cards, because I could like try to create a simulation of reality, like in a computer or something like that. And I could try to figure out like how to make, gravity work or something like that. I could get like like tweak my own physics engine or something like that. And I could tweak all the parameters so that way it does what I want it to do. But just because I've built a system over here that does what I want it to do doesn't mean that it actually maps to reality. You would have to test it and see if it maps to reality. And that's what I see you not doing. I see you saying that it's this way, postulating that it's this way, saying it's and then when I say, oh, it's just an assumption, you're just saying that. And then you go, well, everything's just an assumption. Even it's like you have to create a flatland of value to be able to justify your belief. Like you have to bring science down a peg down here and almost kind of act like it's like a type of theology, or that it's like, biased in all of these ways. And I feel like you even did this thing where, like you point to the Planck scale of reality and you're like, oh, but now we have quantum physics and stuff. So it's like now all the most well-founded and well understood and like set in stone science becomes gets put into this kind of questionable position, like, well, maybe it's not actually, maybe we don't actually know all the things that we think that we know, because some of our least established science like supposedly proves it wrong. And it's like,
What's least established? Quantum theory?
Yeah, I mean, like
it's the most well-established predictive model that scientists have ever come up with. It's been around for 100 years.
There's that quote that if you think that you understand quantum theory, you don't understand quantum theory. And I think it's also wrong to think that it contradicts the levels of reality, like just because the things work different at a lower scale of reality doesn't negate the fact that they work different at another. I almost feel like this idea that there needs to be like a unified theory, or that one negates the other, is like starting from a wrong place anyways. Like, who says there needs to be a unified theory, or who says that one negates the other?
Natural science is totally predicated on the idea that there's a unity to nature. If there's no unity to nature and its laws or its habits, then there's no way to mathematically engage in measuring physical phenomena and arrive at a theory. So there has to be unity. That's a presupposition of science.
It doesn't negate the unity. It just means that different things work different on different levels. Just because there's not a unified principle that governs every level of reality doesn't mean that there's not a unity.
Science is the search for the unifying principle.
Okay.
Yeah, always. I mean, that's just what science is looking for.
I mean, I thought you said earlier that science was about trying to understand what's actually going on.
Well, yeah. Yeah, but science is searching for a systematic explanation of things.
Well, to the extent to which it's like it wants to pre-assume that what's going on is that there should be a set of laws or principles that works across all domains. I would say that is probably going too far, and there's not necessarily a reason to think that. But maybe that's a different topic. I guess my main point here is that I feel like you end up kind of relativizing science and like a lot of our knowledge, and like trying to like bring it down a peg, as if it's on a like level of assertion and the lack of security to kind of justify the lack of groundedness of your own ideas.
Yeah, not at all. Not at all. Not trying to relativize science at all. I take science very seriously. Neither one of us tonight is doing science. We're doing metaphysics and philosophy. And in that domain, unfortunately, we don't have the same experimental method that scientists have. We're dealing with general ideas and categories and logic and dialectic, and trying to make sense of what science has revealed.
Well, logic and science are the testing grounds of philosophy. Okay, like if you can't prove your idea about agency going all the way down and back with science, can you justify this poetry logically?
I mean, I've been trying to do that all night. I don't think logical proof is a high standard. That most logical proofs, things that you can prove logically, they're pretty trivial. Well,
it starts there. You'd have to actually test it. But I mean, if it doesn't pass the standard of logic, then you don't have a coherent idea to even try to test.
Well, really by questioning emergence, I'm seeking logical consistency. That's my argument against emergence, is that I don't understand the logical pathway where you get from particles in motion to beings with emotion. Like, I don't see the logical pathway from one to the other. That's why I question emergence, because I find it logically incoherent.
Okay, well, I'm saying that's fine that you think that. I'm wondering, though, what about your view? Is your view logically coherent? Okay, but how is it justified? Like logically or with science? Like, how have you at all figured out a way to take your map and prove that it touches reality?
By engaging with, as best as I can understand it, the most advanced physics and biology and psychology and
all that stuff seems to agree with emergentism, though. Like, doesn't it?
I don't deny that higher orders of complexity emerge over the course of evolution. I don't think that there's any biologist or any neuroscientist or any physicist that's given an account for how consciousness can emerge from the stuff that they study.
Right, because if it's interior stuff and we're talking about subjectivity and relative programming, that's not something that you can just measure objectively. Those are not objective things. Those are subjective and intersubjective things. And so this idea that you think, or even the suggestion that until we have the objective proof for subjective and intersubjective things, that we don't know what's going on, is like putting an unreasonable standard for validation on there, because it's impossible to objectively measure subjective and intersubjective things.
How we doing, Bruce?
Yeah, how we doing, Bruce?
I think we're probably at a time of reaching the viewer's limit of endurance. And
I feel them.
yeah, it's been a great talk. I feel like there's actually probably more that needs to come. I would be personally interested, and I'm a moderator supposed to be neutral, but I would be personally interested in how David would actually be able to stand up to the same barrage of questions. I think it would end up most likely in metaphysical assertion as well, because there are no demonstrated empirical proofs of the emergence of consciousness yet. So I think it would be interesting to maybe take
I'll
it.
cross-examine David next.
Yeah, yeah.
Next
So I
time.
think
when I put forward my roundup emergentist case, I'm going to be inviting all takers. So I guess we'll get there.
yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, that'd be great. And I think you've done, I think, a wonderful job, basically really probing each other's perspectives and laying out a lot of rich territory for everybody to think about. So I appreciate that, and I think it's a good start to hopefully a longer dialogue and exploration for the whole community.
Excellent. Thanks again, Matthew, for coming in and for stepping up and holding your ground, and I really appreciate that. Thank you as well, Bruce, for hosting.
Yeah, likewise, David. I appreciate you, and thanks, Bruce, for your cool, calm, and collected moderation, and for everything you do with the integral stage. Yeah, this was fun.